Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County, Nebraska for 18 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything small-town law enforcement could throw at me. Bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional meth lab tucked away in some farmer's barn. Millbrook's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Population 3,847 as of the last census. And most problems get sorted out over coffee at Mabel's Diner before they ever reach my desk. That changed on October 15, 2019. My name is Robert Bob Carver, and what I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I'm going to describe it. I've gone over the details 1,000 times in my head, checked the recordings, reviewed the evidence log. None of it makes any more sense now than it did that cold Tuesday morning when the call came in. The day started normal enough. I was at my desk by 6:30 a.m., working through incident reports from the weekend. Nothing serious. A fender bender out on County Road 47, Mrs. Henderson's cat stuck in another tree, the usual small-town quiet that most folks take for granted. The coffee was hot. The October air had that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far off, and the morning sun was just starting to filter through the station windows. My office sits on the second floor of the old courthouse, a red brick building that's been the heart of Millbrook since 1892. From my window, I can see most of the downtown, all 4 blocks of it, and watch the morning routine that never changes much. Harvey opens his hardware store at 7 a.m. sharp. Mabel arrives at the diner by 6:30 to start the coffee, and by 8 o'clock you can pretty much predict who'll be sitting at which table, having the same conversations they've been having for 20 years. I'd worked my way through 3 cups of coffee and was making notes about replacing the transmission in Unit 3 when the phone rang at 7:43 a.m. Millbrook County Sheriff's Office, this is Sheriff Carver. The voice on the other end was shaking, barely holding together. Male, older, familiar, but distressed enough that I couldn't immediately place it. Sheriff, this is William Hartwell. I need to report a domestic violence incident at my farm. William Hartwell. I knew Bill, had known him for 15 years. Quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but not in a suspicious way. He'd been farming his family's land about 12 miles west of town for the better part of 40 years, ever since he'd come back from Vietnam and taken over when his father had his first heart attack. His wife, Margaret, was a sweet woman, taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church, always brought pies to the county fair. She made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and every year at the fair people would line up just to buy a slice. The idea of domestic violence at the Hartwell place seemed about as likely as finding penguins in the cornfield. Bill was soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man who said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," even to people younger than himself. Margaret was equally gentle, the type of woman who rescued injured birds and kept a garden that was half vegetables and half flowers because she thought everything deserved something beautiful to look at. "Slow down, Bill," I said, grabbing a pen and pulling the incident log closer. "What kind of incident are we talking about?" There was a long pause, then what sounded like a sob. When Bill spoke again, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "I hurt her, Sheriff. I hurt Margaret real bad. You need to come out here and bring an ambulance." My blood went cold. In 18 years wearing a badge, I'd handled my share of domestic calls, and they never got easier. The worst ones were always the couples who seemed perfect from the outside. The families where the violence simmered under a facade of normalcy until something finally cracked and shattered everything. "Bill, I need you to listen to me carefully," I said, already reaching for my radio to dispatch Deputy Martinez. "Is Margaret conscious? Is she breathing?" Another pause, longer this time. I could hear something in the background, what sounded like the television, some morning talk show playing at low volume. Normal sounds from what should have been a normal morning. I don't know. There's so much blood, Sheriff. I think I might have killed her. The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my years in law enforcement, I'd heard confessions before, but something about the way Bill said it, the flat, emotionless delivery after the initial crying, sent a chill down my spine. "Okay, Bill, I need you to check if she's breathing. Can you do that for me?" I can't look at her again. God help me, I can't look at what I did." I was already on my feet, grabbing my keys and hat from the hook by the door. My radio crackled as I keyed the mic. "Martinez, I need you to respond to 1247 County Road West. Domestic violence call, possible assault with serious injury. I'm en route. ETA 20 minutes. "Copy that, Sheriff. Request medical?" "Affirmative. Have them stage at the end of the driveway until we secure the scene." I went back to the phone. "Bill, I'm going to stay on the line with you. Deputy Martinez is on her way, and I'm heading out there now. Do not touch anything. Do not move, Margaret. Just stay where you are. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "And Bill? If Margaret is still alive, she needs medical attention. I'm calling for an ambulance now." I hung up and immediately called dispatch for emergency medical services, then radioed Martinez with additional details. The Hartwell farm was a good 20-minute drive from town, mostly along winding county roads that cut through corn and soybean fields that stretched to the horizon. In October, the corn was ready for harvest. Tall stalks turned brown and dry, rustling in the wind like whispered secrets. I made the drive in 15 minutes, pushing the Crown Vic harder than I probably should have on those narrow blacktop roads. The patrol car's radio crackled constantly with updates. Martinez was 10 minutes behind me. The ambulance was en route. Dispatch was trying to get additional details from Bill, but he wasn't answering his phone. The Hartwell property sat at the end of a quarter-mile gravel drive that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees before opening into a farmyard. It was a modest operation by Nebraska standards, a white two-story farmhouse with green shutters that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1950s, surrounded by a barn, a machine shed, a grain silo, and several smaller outbuildings. Maybe 160 acres of corn and soybeans, plus a small pasture where Bill kept a handful of cattle more for tradition than profit. I'd been to the Hartwell place a few times over the years, once for a burglary report that turned out to be raccoons in the feed shed. Another time when Bill's tractor had rolled into the drainage ditch and he'd needed help getting it out. Always pleasant visits, always coffee and conversation about crops and weather. Margaret usually bringing out homemade cookies and asking about my wife, Laura. As I pulled into the farmyard, I could see Bill sitting on the front porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard the cruiser's tires on gravel, and even from a distance I could see that something was terribly wrong. His white t-shirt was stained dark red across the front, and there were smears on his hands and forearms that could only be blood. I parked about 20 feet from the house and approached carefully, one hand resting on my sidearm. You never know how someone's going to react in a situation like this, especially if they're in shock or having some kind of breakdown. I'd seen domestic situations go sideways in a heartbeat, seen men who seemed calm and rational suddenly become violent when the reality of what they'd done started to sink in. "Bill, I called out when I was about 10 feet away. "I'm going to need you to stand up slowly and put your hands where I can see them, okay?" He looked up at me with the kind of hollow expression I'd seen before. The look of someone who'd crossed a line they never thought they could cross, and were just starting to comprehend the enormity of what they'd done. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale except for a smear of blood on his left cheek. "She's inside," he said quietly, "in the kitchen. I'm going to check on her, Bill. You stay right here and keep your hands visible." I approached the front door, noting that it was standing open about 6 inches. No sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been involved. The screen door was latched, but not locked. Through the gap I could see into the living room, a comfortable space with furniture that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than style. Family photos on the mantel, a well-worn couch facing an old television, everything neat and tidy. It was only when I stepped into the kitchen that I saw what Bill was talking about. There was blood everywhere. It wasn't the clean puddle you might see from a single injury, but the chaotic spray and splatter pattern that spoke of violence, repeated violence. The white linoleum floor was stained dark red in a rough oval near the kitchen table, with droplets and smears extending toward the sink and the back door. The kitchen table itself was overturned, chairs scattered. A coffee cup lay shattered near the refrigerator, and what looked like a cast-iron skillet was on the floor near the stove, dark stains on the handle. But Margaret Hartwell was nowhere to be seen. I drew my weapon and began systematically clearing the house, moving room by room, calling out as I went. "Margaret? Mrs. Hartwell? This is Sheriff Carver. If you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. The house was small by modern standards. Living room, kitchen, and a small den on the first floor, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. I checked every room, every closet, even looked under the beds. No sign of Margaret, alive or dead. The blood trail ended in the kitchen. There were no drag marks leading to other parts of the house, no indication that a body had been moved. I checked the basement, a low-ceilinged space that Bill used for storage and canning. Mason jars lined wooden shelves, filled with vegetables from Margaret's garden. A few pieces of old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, the usual accumulation of a lifetime spent in one place. No Margaret. Back outside, I found Bill still sitting on the porch steps, staring at his hands. Deputy Martinez had arrived and was standing near her patrol car, waiting for instructions. "Martinez, secure the perimeter. Don't let anyone else into the house until the crime scene team gets here." "Copy that, Sheriff. What's the situation?" I walked over to where Bill was sitting, my weapon holstered, but my hand still resting on the grip. "Bill, where's Margaret?" He looked up at me with confusion written across his face. "What do you mean?" "She's in the kitchen." "No, Bill, I just checked the entire house. Margaret isn't here." The confusion on his face deepened, and for a moment he looked like he might cry again. "That's not possible. I just saw her. She was making breakfast and God help me, I lost my temper." "Tell me exactly what happened, Bill." He took a shuddering breath, his hands trembling slightly. "She was standing at the stove, making eggs and bacon. She had on that yellow dress she likes, the one with the little flowers. She was humming. She always hums when she cooks. And she said something about the farm, about maybe selling some of the land to pay for repairs on the barn." I pulled out my notebook and started taking notes. "What happened then?" I snapped. "We've been struggling, Sheriff. The farm's been losing money for 3 years, and I've been trying to hold it together, but Margaret doesn't understand. This land has been in my family for 70 years. My grandfather cleared half those fields by hand. What exactly did you do, Bill?" The words came out in a whisper. "I hit her. I grabbed that skillet from the stove and I hit her with it. She fell down, and there was blood, and I hit her again. And again. His voice broke. She wasn't moving, Sheriff. There was so much blood and she wasn't moving. I studied his face carefully. Bill Hartwell was either the best actor I'd ever encountered, or he genuinely believed what he was telling me. The blood on his clothes was real. The blood in the kitchen was real. But there was no body. Bill, after the incident, what did you do? I ran outside and called you. I couldn't stand to look at what I'd done. You didn't move her? You didn't take her anywhere? No. The response was immediate and emphatic. I couldn't even look at her. I just ran outside and called. Martinez caught my eye and nodded toward her patrol car. I followed her over, leaving Bill under the watchful eye of a newly arrived deputy. What do you think, Sheriff? I think we've got a problem, I said quietly. There's definitely been violence in that kitchen. Blood spatter patterns consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. But there's no victim. You think he's lying? Maybe trying to cover up something else? I looked back at Bill, who was now crying quietly into his hands. I don't think he's lying. I think he believes every word he's telling us. But that doesn't explain where Margaret is. The ambulance arrived, followed 20 minutes later by our small crime scene team. Really, just Deputy Chen with a camera and evidence collection kit. We photographed everything, collected blood samples, dusted for fingerprints. The blood was definitely human, and initial field testing suggested it was consistent with Margaret's type. But Margaret Hartwell was nowhere to be found. We organized a search of the property, bringing in additional deputies and volunteers from town. We combed through every outbuilding, every field, checked the farm pond, even brought in cadaver dogs to search the wooded area behind the house. The dogs showed some interest near the kitchen door, but couldn't pick up a scent trail leading away from the house. Meanwhile, Bill was at the county hospital under police guard, sedated and under observation. Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd been my family physician since I moved to Millbrook, called me that evening with her preliminary assessment. Physically, he's fine, Bob. No signs of injury, no indication of drug or alcohol use. But mentally, I've never seen anything quite like this. He's absolutely convinced that he killed his wife. He describes the incident in perfect detail, shows genuine remorse and trauma. If I didn't know there was no body, I'd say he was telling the truth. But when I suggested that maybe Margaret had survived and gotten away, or that maybe someone else had moved her, he became agitated, insistent that she was dead when he left the kitchen. I spent that evening at the station, reviewing the evidence and trying to make sense of what we'd found. The blood spatter patterns in the kitchen were consistent with Bill's story. Someone had been beaten with a heavy object, probably the cast iron skillet we'd found. The amount of blood suggested serious injury, possibly fatal. But there was no body, no drag marks, no indication of how a severely injured or dead person could have been removed from the scene. Margaret's car was still in the driveway. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter, wallet and keys inside. If she'd somehow survived and fled, she'd done it without taking anything with her. I drove back out to the Hartwell farm that night, wanting to walk through the scene again, without the distraction of other people and equipment. Sometimes details emerged in the quiet that you missed in the chaos of initial response. I let myself into the house with the key Bill had given us, using my flashlight to navigate even though I could have turned on the lights. The crime scene tape was still up in the kitchen, blood stains outlined in chalk, furniture tagged as evidence. I stood in the doorway, trying to visualize what had happened. According to Bill's statement, Margaret had been standing at the stove when the argument started. The skillet had been on the stove, probably still warm from cooking bacon. The blood spatter started near the stove and extended toward the kitchen table, suggesting she'd fallen or been knocked backward. More blood near the table indicated she'd been struck repeatedly while on the ground. But where was the body? The back door was unlocked, opening onto a small porch and the farmyard beyond. I checked the door frame and porch for blood traces, but found nothing. If someone had carried Margaret's body out through the back door, they'd managed to do it without leaving any traces. I was about to leave when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Humming. Someone was humming in the kitchen, a soft, melodic tune that seemed familiar. I drew my weapon and moved carefully toward the sound, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty room. "Margaret!" I called out. "Mrs. Hartwell?" The humming stopped, but I could have sworn I heard footsteps. Light, quick steps moving across the linoleum floor. I turned on the overhead lights, flooding the kitchen with harsh fluorescent illumination. The room was empty, exactly as we'd left it. Bloodstains on the floor, overturned furniture, evidence markers still in place. But I could have sworn I'd heard someone humming. Someone walking across that floor. I stood perfectly still, listening. Old houses make all kinds of sounds. Settling timbers, wind through loose windows, the expansion and contraction of materials as temperatures change. But what I'd heard was definitely human. I was about to convince myself it had been my imagination when I saw her. Margaret Hartwell was standing at the stove, her back to me, stirring something in a pan. She was wearing the yellow dress Bill had described, her gray hair pinned up in its usual neat bun. She looked perfectly normal, perfectly alive, humming softly as she cooked. "Mrs. Hartwell." She turned toward me and I saw that her face was a ruin of blood and bone. The left side of her skull was caved in, a dark depression that should have been instantly fatal. Her left eye was gone. Nothing but a dark socket weeping blood. More blood had dried in thick streams down her cheek and neck, staining the collar of her yellow dress. When she smiled, I could see that several of her teeth were missing, broken off at the gum line. "Hello, Sheriff Carver," she said in a voice that sounded exactly like Margaret, sweet and kind, and completely at odds with the horror of her appearance. "Would you like some breakfast? I was just making Bill's eggs the way he likes them." I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the light switch. When the overhead fluorescence flickered off and on again, the kitchen was empty. No Margaret, no smell of cooking food, just the bloodstains and overturned furniture and the terrible silence of an empty house. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran from that house like the devil himself was chasing me, stumbled across the farmyard to my patrol car, and drove back to town with my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat in the station parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was stress, exhaustion, the product of too many hours and too much coffee in a case that didn't make sense. But I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I drove to Lincoln and convinced the state police to take over the investigation. I told them we didn't have the resources to handle a potential murder case, which was true enough. I didn't tell them about what I'd seen in the kitchen. Bill Hartwell was eventually committed to the state psychiatric hospital in Norfolk. The doctors diagnosed him with a severe psychotic break, possibly triggered by financial stress and early-stage dementia. He never wavered in his story. He had killed his wife in their kitchen on the morning of October 15th, and he would spend the rest of his life paying for that sin. Margaret Hartwell was never found. The case officially remains open, classified as a missing person investigation. The state police theory is that Margaret left town voluntarily, possibly to escape an abusive marriage that had escalated to violence, and that Bill's confession was either fabricated to cover up something else or the result of mental illness. The farm was eventually sold to pay for Bill's care. A young family from Omaha bought it, attracted by the affordable price and the peaceful rural setting. They lasted 6 months. The husband called me 3 weeks after they moved in, voice shaking as he described sounds in the kitchen at night. Humming, footsteps, the smell of bacon cooking when no one was in the room. I told him old houses made strange sounds, suggested he check the pipes and the heating system. He called again a week later, said his wife had seen a woman in a yellow dress standing at the stove, but when she'd turned on the lights, no one was there. They moved out the next day. The house sat empty for 2 years before another family tried it. They lasted 3 months. Then it was 6 weeks for the next family. Then just 2 weeks. Word got around town, the way word does in small places. People started calling it the Hartwell place again, even though Bill Hartwell had been gone for years. I retired 18 months after the Hartwell case, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with my family. Laura and I moved to Arizona, where the winters are warm and the houses are new, and you don't hear footsteps in empty rooms or smell bacon cooking in abandoned kitchens. I never told anyone the full story of what I saw that night. Who would believe it? I barely believe it myself. But sometimes late at night when the desert wind is howling around our house in Phoenix, I think about Margaret Hartwell standing at that stove, humming while she cooked breakfast for a husband who may or may not have killed her. And I wonder if love can be strong enough to transcend not just death, but reality itself. I wonder if there are some bonds that can't be broken by violence, some commitments that survive even when everything else is destroyed. The Hartwell place has been empty now for 5 years. The county seized it for unpaid taxes, and it sits abandoned on that gravel road 12 miles west of town. But people driving past still report lights in the kitchen windows sometimes. Sometimes they say they smell bacon cooking. Sometimes, late at night, they hear humming drifting across the fields. A woman's voice, soft and sweet, singing while she makes breakfast for someone who will never come home again. Last month, a real estate developer from Lincoln called the county about buying the property. He wants to tear down the old house and build something modern, said he's not superstitious about whatever stories people tell. The county was happy to talk. They'd love to get it back on the tax rolls. But I heard through the grapevine that the developer drove out to look at the place on a Tuesday morning in October. Spent about 10 minutes walking around the property, then got back in his car and drove away. He never called the county back. I don't know what he saw or heard in those 10 minutes, but I have a pretty good idea. Some places hold on to their secrets. Some love affairs don't end with death. And sometimes, in small-town America, the boundaries between what's real and what's possible get a little blurred. The Hartwell place is still for sale, if anyone's interested, but I'd recommend visiting on a Sunday afternoon, when the sun is high and the shadows are short. I wouldn't recommend going there in the early morning, when the mist is rising from the fields and the air smells like breakfast cooking in an empty house. My name is James McCarthy, and I've been serving as sheriff of Riverside County, Montana for 12 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a deputy, working my way up through the ranks in what most people would call a quiet corner of the world. Riverside County sits in the northwestern part of the state, where the forests start to give way to farmland, and the mountains loom blue and distant on the horizon. We cover about 2,100 square miles with a population of just under 6,000 people, spread across ranches and small communities connected by 2-lane highways and gravel roads that wind through valleys carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago. It's the kind of place where neighbors might be separated by miles of wilderness, but everyone still knows everyone else's business. That isolation, that self-reliance that comes with living in big country, is usually what I love most about the job. People here tend to handle their own problems, work things out among themselves. When they do call the sheriff's office, it's usually because something has gone beyond what neighbors can fix with a conversation over a fence line. Which is why the call I received on March 22, 2020, should have been routine. The morning started with the kind of weather that made you grateful to live in Montana. Clear skies, crisp air that carried the smell of pine, and the promise of snow melting in the high country. I was in my office at the county building in Riverside, a modest brick structure that housed the sheriff's department, county offices, and the small jail that we used mostly for overnight holds and the occasional drunk tank occupancy. My office window looks out over Main Street, all 3 blocks of it, and beyond that to the rolling hills that stretch toward the Cabinet Mountains. On a clear day like this one, you could see the snow-capped peaks 50 miles away, rising above the forest like something from a postcard. Riverside isn't much to look at. A few hundred people clustered around a main street that serves the surrounding ranches and logging operations. We've got a grocery store, a hardware store, a diner that serves the best chicken fried steak in 3 counties, and a gas station that doubles as the informal community center where everyone gathers to discuss weather, politics, and whose cattle are getting into whose pasture. I was reviewing budget reports, the eternal struggle of rural law enforcement, trying to figure out how to stretch limited resources across a large territory with a small tax base, when Deputy Sarah Collins knocked on my door. Collins had been with the department for 3 years, a local girl who'd gone away to college in Missoula and come back with a degree in criminal justice and a desire to serve her community. She was thorough, professional, and had the kind of calm presence that helped defuse tense situations before they escalated. "Sheriff, we've got a property dispute out on the Blackwood Road. Ted Morrison and Frank Kellerman. Apparently, they're having some kind of disagreement about their fence line." I knew both men, though not well. Ted Morrison ran a small cattle operation on land his family had homesteaded back in the 1920s, when the government was still giving away land to anyone willing to work it. The Morrison place was a classic Montana ranch, modest but successful, the kind of operation that had been supporting the same family for 3 generations. Frank Kellerman was newer to the area, had moved up from California about 5 years ago and bought the adjacent property with plans to build some kind of eco-friendly ranch. He was the type of newcomer that made longtime locals nervous. Too much money, too many ideas about how things should be done differently, not enough understanding of how things had always been done. "What kind of disagreement?" I asked, closing the budget folder with relief. Property disputes weren't exciting, but they were a welcome break from trying to figure out how to afford new tires for the patrol vehicles. Collins checked her notes. "Morrison called it in about an hour ago. Says Kellerman moved their boundary fence overnight, claiming about 20 acres of Morrison's pasture. Morrison wants us to come out and document it before he takes matters into his own hands." I sighed and reached for my hat. The threat about taking matters into his own hands wasn't idle. I'd seen property disputes escalate quickly in ranch country, where land meant everything, and moving someone's fence line was tantamount to stealing their livelihood. "Tell Morrison I'll be out there in an hour, and call Mike Patterson, see if he can meet us out there this afternoon." Mike Patterson was the county surveyor, a detail-oriented man in his 50s who'd been measuring and mapping Riverside County for the better part of 20 years. If anyone could sort out a property line dispute, it was Mike. The drive to the Morrison place took me through some of the most beautiful country in Montana, rolling hills covered in prairie grass and scattered stands of aspen and cottonwood, the Cabinet Mountains rising in the distance like a wall of blue and white. The Blackwood Road was a well-maintained gravel county road that wound through ranch country, connecting half a dozen properties to the main highway. It was the kind of drive that reminded me why I'd chosen to stay in Montana after college, despite job offers from police departments in Seattle and Denver. There's something about big sky country that gets into your blood, makes it hard to imagine living anywhere else. The sheer scale of it, the way the landscape makes you feel both insignificant and connected to something larger than yourself. The Morrison Ranch sat in a valley between two low ridges. A classic Montana spread with a modest two-story house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and maybe 300 head of cattle scattered across several thousand acres of grazing land. The house looked like it had been built to last. Simple lines, solid construction, the kind of place that had weathered decades of hard winters and hot summers without complaint. Ted Morrison was waiting for me in his driveway, a tall, lean man in his 50s with the weathered look that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. His face was lined from squinting into sun and wind. His hands were calloused from handling cattle and machinery, and his expression was tight with anger, but controlled anger, the kind that came from feeling wronged rather than looking for a fight. "Sheriff McCarthy," he said, extending a hand that was as hard as wood. "Thanks for coming out. Ted, Sarah said you're having some trouble with your fence line?" Morrison's jaw tightened, and he pointed toward the eastern edge of his property. "More than trouble. Kellerman moved our boundary fence sometime during the night. Claimed about 20 acres of my best pasture ground." I followed his gaze toward a fence line that ran north-south across what looked like prime grazing land. The fence appeared to be relatively new, steel posts and high-tensile wire that gleamed in the morning sun. "You sure about where the original boundary was?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Sheriff, my family's been working this land for almost 100 years. My grandfather homesteaded this section in 1923, and I could walk that fence line blindfolded. Hell, I helped my grandfather rebuild part of it when I was 12 years old, after a bad winter brought down a bunch of trees." He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Here's the deed, shows the legal description of the property. That fence line's been in the same place since my grandfather first surveyed it." I studied the deed. Property descriptions in rural Montana can be complex, involving section lines, geographic features, and survey markers that might have been placed decades ago and could be difficult to locate. But Morrison's property was clearly described, with specific references to steel survey posts and natural landmarks. "Where's Kellerman now?" "Up at his place, I assume. I went up there about an hour ago to talk to him about it, and he acted like I was the one who was confused. Said the fence had always been where it is now, said maybe I was getting old and forgetting things." Morrison's voice carried the kind of controlled anger that suggested he was a man who'd been pushed close to his limit. In ranch country, moving someone's fence line wasn't just theft. It was a violation of boundaries that went deeper than property law, an attack on family history and livelihood. "Let's go talk to him," I said. We drove up the gravel road that connected the two properties, maybe half a mile through Morrison's land and then across what was now apparently disputed territory. The contrast between the two places was stark. Morrison's ranch looked like it had grown organically from the land over decades, while the Kellerman place had the designed feel of someone trying to create a particular vision. The house was a modern log structure with large windows and solar panels, surrounded by what looked like experimental gardens, and small pastures divided by expensive rail fencing. Everything was neat, clean, and obviously expensive. The kind of place that belonged in a magazine about sustainable living. Frank Kellerman was working in one of his gardens when we pulled up. A stocky man in his early 40s with the soft look of someone who'd spent most of his life behind a desk before deciding to play at being a rancher. He wore clean work clothes that looked like they'd been purchased specifically for gardening, and his hands were protected by leather gloves that showed little sign of actual use. He looked up as we approached, his expression wary but not particularly concerned. Sheriff McCarthy, Ted. He nodded to both of us with the careful politeness of someone who knew he was in a potentially difficult situation. What can I do for you? Frank, we're here about the fence line between your property and Ted's. Ted says it's been moved. Kellerman's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been confusion or concern. I'm afraid Ted's mistaken. The fence line is exactly where it's always been, right along the legal boundary between our properties. Morrison stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. Frank, that fence was a good 20 yards east of where it is now. You moved it onto my land. Ted, I understand you might be frustrated, but I haven't moved anything. Maybe you should have your property surveyed if you're confused about where your boundaries are. The suggestion that Morrison might be confused about his own property was like pouring gasoline on a fire. I could see the older man's anger building, but he kept it controlled. Barely. Frank, I've got the deed right here. I've got survey stakes that were set by my grandfather in 1923. That fence line has been moved. Kellerman shrugged with the kind of casual dismissal that probably hadn't served him well in his dealings with Montana ranchers. I'm sorry, but I disagree. The fence is where it's always been. I pulled out my notebook, trying to keep the situation from escalating. Frank, do you have your deed? The legal description of your property? Of course. Kellerman disappeared into his house and returned a few minutes later with a folder full of documents. He pulled out a deed and handed it to me with the confidence of someone who believed paperwork would settle everything. I compared the two deeds, checking the legal descriptions against each other. Both properties were clearly described, with the boundary between them running along a specific section line marked by steel survey posts placed during the original government survey. All right, I said. We need to locate the actual survey markers and see where they are in relation to the current fence line. If someone moved the fence, we should be able to tell pretty quickly. We walked toward the disputed area. The three of us spread out as we looked for survey markers. In rural Montana, property corners are typically marked with steel posts or brass caps set in concrete, often decades old and sometimes difficult to find if they've been overgrown or damaged by weather and time. Finding survey markers can be like archaeological work. You're looking for evidence of decisions made by people who are long dead, markers placed according to standards and techniques that might not match modern surveying practices. But they're legal markers, and when you find them, they settle disputes with the authority of law. It was Morrison who found the first marker, a steel post about 3 feet long with a brass cap marked with survey information. It was about 15 feet east of the current fence line, partially hidden by tall grass but unmistakably a legal survey marker. There, Morrison said, pointing to the marker with satisfaction. That's the southeast corner of my property. The fence should run north from here. We found the second marker about a quarter-mile north, following the fence line and searching carefully through the grass and brush. Like the first marker, it was about 15 feet east of the current fence, consistent with Morrison's claim that the fence had been moved. As we searched for additional markers, I noticed something odd about the fence itself. It was obviously new. The posts were clean steel without any rust. The wire was bright and untarnished. But there were no signs of recent construction around the posts. No disturbed soil, no equipment tracks, no indication that heavy machinery had been used to install the fence. Frank, I said, when we'd located 3 markers, all showing the same pattern, the survey markers clearly show that the fence has been moved onto Ted's property. Kellerman stared at the markers as if he'd never seen them before. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion. That's not possible. The fence has always been where it is now. I've got photos. I've got... He trailed off, looking genuinely puzzled. Frank, do you remember moving the fence? Do you remember hiring someone to move it? Number: No, I didn't move any fence. The fence has always been right where it is. Morrison was getting impatient. Sheriff, this is ridiculous. The man moved my fence and now he's playing dumb about it. I studied Kellerman's face carefully. I'd interviewed enough suspects over the years to recognize the difference between someone who was lying and someone who was genuinely confused. Kellerman looked genuinely puzzled, not like someone who was trying to cover up theft. All right, I said. Here's what we're going to do. Frank, you need to move that fence back to the legal property line. Ted, I want you to take photos of everything as it stands now, and we'll document the survey markers. I'm going to call this in as possible theft of property, and we'll need to get formal statements from both of you. Kellerman nodded slowly. Of course, I'll have the fence moved back. I don't understand how this happened, but I'll make it right. The county surveyor, Mike Patterson, met us at the property that afternoon. Patterson had been surveying in Riverside County for 20 years, and if anyone could make sense of a property dispute, it was him. Well, he said, after spending an hour with his equipment, checking angles and measurements. The survey markers are definitely in their original positions. The fence has been moved, probably sometime in the last few days, based on the soil disturbance around the posts. Any idea how long it would take to move a fence line that long? I asked. Patterson studied the fence, pulling a measuring tape from his equipment bag. With the right equipment? A few hours, maybe. You'd need a tractor with a post hole digger, a crew of 3 or 4 men. It's not something you'd do quietly. That was puzzling. Morrison's house was only half a mile away, and sound carried far in the open country. If someone had spent several hours moving fence posts with heavy equipment, someone should have heard it. Ted, you didn't hear any equipment running during the night? Morrison shook his head. Nothing. And I'm a light sleeper, Sheriff. The cattle would have raised hell if there'd been strangers running machinery in their pasture. Over the next several days, I investigated the fence moving as I would any other theft case. I interviewed both men extensively, checked with local fence contractors to see if anyone had been hired to do the work, even looked into the possibility that someone else might have been involved, maybe trying to stir up trouble between the neighbors. I came up empty. No one had been hired to move the fence. No one had seen or heard the heavy equipment in the area. There were no tracks in the pasture except for cattle and the tire marks from our own vehicles. But the fence had definitely been moved. 3 days after my initial visit, Kellerman called the office. Sheriff McCarthy? This is Frank Kellerman. I need you to come out here again. Something strange is happening. I found Kellerman standing in his driveway, staring toward the disputed fence line with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion this time, but something closer to fear. Frank, what's going on? He pointed toward the fence. It moved again. I looked toward the fence line, and my heart sank. The fence was back in its original position, claiming Morrison's land again. When did this happen? Sometime last night. Sheriff, I swear to you, I moved that fence back to the legal line 3 days ago. I watched the crew move every post, and this morning it's back where it started. I called Morrison, and he met us at the fence line 20 minutes later. His anger had been replaced by something else. A wariness that suggested he was beginning to think there was more going on here than a simple property dispute. Ted, did you move the fence back? Morrison shook his head. Hell no. If I'd wanted that fence moved, I'd have done it myself years ago. We examined the fence posts. They showed clear evidence of being moved twice. Disturbed soil, fresh marks on the posts where equipment had gripped them. but there were no equipment tracks, no sign that heavy machinery had been in the area. "All right," I said. "We're going to set up surveillance. I want to know what's happening here." That night, I parked my patrol vehicle on a hill overlooking the disputed fence line and settled in to watch. I had a thermos of coffee, a pair of binoculars, and a camera with a telephoto lens. If someone was playing games with the fence, I was going to catch them at it. The night was clear and cold, with enough moon to provide decent visibility across the pasture. I could see the fence line clearly, a dark line cutting across the pale grass. The silence was complete, except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant sound of wind through the trees. At 2:17 a.m., the fence moved. Not all at once, and not with any visible cause. The posts simply shifted. One by one, starting at the south end of the line and moving north, each post slid about 20 yards west, taking the wire with it. There was no sound, no heavy equipment, no crew of workers. The posts just moved, as if the earth itself was rearranging the boundary. I watched through my binoculars, hardly believing what I was seeing. It took about 10 minutes for the entire fence line to complete its movement, and when it was done, the fence was back in its original position, claiming Morrison's land. I sat in my patrol car for another hour, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Then I drove home and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I called the State Bureau of Investigation. "This is Sheriff McCarthy in Riverside County. I need some help with a case that's gotten unusual." Agent Linda Torres arrived 2 days later, a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in cases involving fraud and theft. I briefed her on the situation, leaving out the detail about watching the fence move by itself. "So, we have 2 neighbors in a property dispute, and someone keeps moving the fence back and forth. Something like that." Torres spent a day interviewing both men, examining the physical evidence, checking property records. She came to the same conclusion I had. Someone was moving the fence, but there was no evidence of who or how. "Sheriff McCarthy, this is one of the strangest cases I've worked. The fence has clearly been moved multiple times, but there's no physical evidence of how it's being done. No equipment tracks, no witnesses, nothing. What do you think is happening?" Torres was quiet for a long moment. "I think someone is playing an elaborate prank, or trying to drive these 2 men crazy, or..." She paused. "Or there's something going on here that doesn't fit into normal categories." That night, Torres joined me on surveillance. We parked on the hill overlooking the fence line, both of us equipped with cameras and recording equipment. At 1:43 a.m., it happened again. Torres watched through her binoculars as the fence posts moved themselves across 20 yards of pasture, shifting the boundary line back onto Morrison's property. She didn't say anything for a long time, just kept staring through the binoculars even after the movement had stopped. Finally, she lowered the binoculars and looked at me. "Sheriff, what the hell did we just see? I was hoping you could tell me." Torres spent another 2 days investigating, bringing in additional resources from the State Bureau. Soil samples, photographs, metal detectors, even ground-penetrating radar to look for underground equipment that might explain the fence movement. Nothing. She finally closed the case as unsolved due to insufficient evidence, which was bureau speak for "we have no idea what's happening here." 6 months later, Ted Morrison sold his ranch and moved to Arizona. He told me he couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore, never knowing where his fence line would be from one day to the next. The constant stress of dealing with a boundary that seemed to have a mind of its own had worn him down. Frank Kellerman stayed, but he stopped trying to farm the disputed land. He put up a sign that read, "Property line uncertain," and let the area go back to wild grass. The fence still moves. I've driven past the property dozens of times since then, and the fence line shifts back and forth like some kind of slow-motion pendulum, marking a boundary that exists according to laws and deeds and survey markers, but apparently not according to whatever forces actually control the land. I've never told anyone the full story of what Torres and I witnessed that night. Who would believe it? But sometimes, when I'm out on patrol in the early hours of the morning, I think about boundaries and property lines, and the idea that human beings can own pieces of the earth. Maybe the land has its own ideas about where the boundaries should be. Maybe our surveys and deeds and legal descriptions don't mean as much as we think they do. Maybe there are older claims on the land, older boundaries that we can't see or understand, and sometimes those boundaries assert themselves. I did some research after the case was closed, digging into the history of that particular piece of land. What I found was interesting, if not exactly conclusive. The area had been disputed territory long before Morrison's grandfather homesteaded it. There were records of conflicts between different Native American tribes over hunting rights in that valley, disputes that went back centuries. The Kootenai and the Blackfeet had both claimed the land, and there had been battles fought over those same 20 acres that the fence kept claiming. More recently, there had been a boundary dispute between two of the original homesteaders in the 1920s. The disagreement had gone all the way to the territorial courts, and from what I could piece together from old county records, it had never been fully resolved. One family had simply given up and moved away, leaving the other to claim the disputed land by default. Maybe some disputes never really end. Maybe they just go dormant for a while, waiting for the right conditions to resurface. The Morrison place sold to a family from Seattle, city people looking for a quiet retreat in the mountains. They lasted 8 months before putting it back on the market. The wife called me once, voice shaking as she described watching the fence line rearrange itself in the middle of the night. The property has changed hands 3 times since then. The current owners are a retired couple from Portland who seem to have made peace with the situation. They don't try to use the disputed 20 acres for anything, just let it be. And interestingly, the fence has been more stable since they took ownership. It still moves occasionally, but not as frequently as it used to. Maybe whatever force is at work there just wants to be acknowledged. Maybe it's not about ownership so much as respect. I still drive past the place sometimes, usually late at night when I'm heading home from a call. The fence is still there, still marking a boundary that exists in some dimension we don't fully understand. Sometimes it's in one position, sometimes in the other, and sometimes, if you watch carefully on a clear night with good moonlight, you can see it moving. Last month, a surveyor from Kalispell called me about the property. He'd been hired by the current owners to do a complete survey, and he wanted to know if I had any information about unusual geological activity in the area. I told him I didn't know anything about geology. He said the fence posts showed clear evidence of movement, but there were no signs of human intervention. No equipment tracks, no tool marks, nothing to suggest how the posts were being moved. He'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of surveying. I wished him luck and suggested he talk to the landowners about it. He called back a week later, said he'd completed the survey but he was having trouble writing his report. According to his measurements, the property line should be exactly where the fence was, but the fence kept moving while he was trying to map it. He asked if I thought he was losing his mind. I told him that in my experience, losing your mind was overrated. Sometimes the world just didn't work the way we expected it to, and the best thing to do was accept that and move on. He thanked me and hung up. I never saw his survey report, but I heard through the county clerk that it was filed as inconclusive due to unstable boundary markers. The fence is still out there, still moving back and forth across those 20 acres of disputed Montana grassland. still marking a boundary that exists somewhere between law and legend, between what we think we know and what the land knows about itself. And I'm okay with that. After 20 years in law enforcement, I've learned that there are some mysteries that don't need to be solved, some questions that are more important than their answers. Sometimes, the best thing a sheriff can do is acknowledge that there are forces in the world bigger than badges and law books, and the certainty that comes with thinking we understand how things work. The fence moves, the land remembers, and somewhere in that vast Montana sky there are boundaries we'll never map, and disputes we'll never settle. But that's okay. Some things are bigger than us, and maybe that's the way it should be. I'm Patricia Williams, and I've been sheriff of Clearwater County, Idaho for 9 years. Before that, I spent 6 years as a deputy in Boise, handling everything from domestic disputes to gang violence in what most people would consider a challenging urban environment. When I took the job in Clearwater County, I thought I was trading complexity for simplicity, trading the unpredictable dangers of city policing for the straightforward problems of rural law enforcement. Clearwater County sits in the northern panhandle of Idaho, a region of dense forests, mountain lakes, and small communities connected by winding highways that follow rivers carved deep into ancient granite. We cover about 2,500 square miles with a population of 8,400 people, most of them living in and around the county seat of Orofino, with the rest scattered across logging towns, fishing camps, and isolated homesteads accessible only by logging roads that wind up into the high country. It's beautiful country, the kind of place people come to escape from whatever they're running from. Dense enough forest that you can disappear if you want to, remote enough that neighbors respect privacy, and far enough from major population centers that the outside world feels very far away, which is why the case of Michael Davidson should have been routine. The call came in on September 14, 2021, on a Tuesday morning that started with the kind of autumn weather that made you grateful to live in Idaho. The aspens were starting to turn gold up in the higher elevations. The air had that crisp bite that promised winter was still months away, and the morning light filtering through the pine trees around the courthouse painted everything in shades of green and gold. I was reviewing case files in my office when Deputy Robert Miller knocked on my door. Miller was relatively new to the department, transferred up from Twin Falls about a year earlier, but he was thorough and reliable, the kind of officer who did things by the book and didn't cut corners. "Sheriff Williams, we've got a missing person report. Michael Davidson, age 67, missing from his cabin up on Dworshack Creek. His daughter called it in from Seattle." I knew the name vaguely. Davidson was one of the semi-permanent residents, the kind of guy who'd moved up to the mountains for privacy and solitude. Lived alone in a cabin about 15 miles from town, came into Orofino maybe once a week for supplies, paid his bills on time, and didn't cause trouble. "What's the daughter's story?" Miller checked his notes. "Susan Davidson Martinez. Says she's been trying to reach her father for over a week. Usually talks to him every Sunday, but he hasn't answered his phone. She drove up from Seattle yesterday to check on him, found the cabin empty. No sign of where he went. Any indication of foul play? Not obvious. She said the cabin looked normal, just empty, like he'd stepped out for a few minutes and never came back." I grabbed my jacket and keys. Missing persons in rural Idaho were usually one of three things: people who'd gotten lost in the woods, people who'd fallen into a river or off a cliff, or people who simply didn't want to be found. The first two could be tragic, but they were straightforward. The third category, well, that was where things got complicated. "Where's the daughter now?" "Waiting at the cabin. Says she doesn't want to leave until we find her father." The drive to Davidson's place took us up into the hills northeast of Orofino, along Doorshack Creek through forest that got thicker and more remote with every mile. The road was paved for the first 10 miles, then turned to gravel, then to dirt that wound through stands of pine and fir so dense you couldn't see 20 feet into the woods. Davidson's cabin sat in a small clearing about a quarter-mile off the main road, accessible by a narrow track that showed signs of regular use but not recent traffic. It was a modest place. Single-story, log construction, maybe 800 square feet with a covered porch and a stone chimney. A small generator shed sat about 50 feet from the main building, and I could see a vegetable garden that had been well maintained through the growing season. Susan Davidson Martinez was waiting on the porch, a woman in her early 40s with the kind of worried expression that suggested she was genuinely concerned about her father, rather than just going through the motions. She stood up as we pulled into the clearing, wrapping a sweater more tightly around herself. "Sheriff Williams? Thank you for coming. I'm Susan. Miss Martinez, Deputy Miller filled me in on the basics. When did you last hear from your father?" "Sunday, September 5th. We talk every week, same time. When he didn't answer this past Sunday, I figured maybe he was in town or out fishing. But when he didn't answer Monday or Tuesday either." She shrugged helplessly. "Dad's very routine-oriented. He always answers the phone." I looked around the clearing. Everything appeared normal. No signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had left in a hurry. "Show me inside." The cabin was neat and organized in the way of someone who lived alone and had developed efficient systems for managing daily life. Kitchen clean, bed made, no dirty dishes in the sink. A few books on the table, reading glasses folded neatly beside them. Everything suggested someone who had stepped out briefly and planned to return. "Does your father own a vehicle?" Susan pointed toward a small shed behind the cabin. "His truck's in there. 2015 Ford pickup barely has any miles on it. He mostly just uses it for trips to town." Miller walked over to check the shed while I continued examining the cabin. In the bedroom, I found clothes hanging in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, prescription medications in the medicine cabinet with recent dates. If Davidson had left voluntarily, he hadn't taken much with him. "Any health issues I should know about?" I asked. "He's in good shape for his age. Takes medication for blood pressure, but nothing serious. No history of mental health problems, no dementia or anything like that." Miller returned from the shed. "Truck's there, keys in the ignition, full tank of gas." That ruled out the possibility that Davidson had driven somewhere and had car trouble. I stepped back onto the porch and surveyed the surrounding forest. Thousands of acres of wilderness in every direction, with streams, cliffs, and enough ways to get lost or injured to keep a search team busy for weeks. "Did your father have any favorite hiking spots? Places he liked to go fishing?" Susan thought about it. "He talked about fishing the creek, but I don't think he went very far from the cabin. Dad wasn't much of a hiker, more of a reader, you know. He came up here for the quiet, not for outdoor adventures." That was useful information. If Davidson wasn't the type to wander far from home, then either something had happened close to the cabin, or he'd left for reasons we didn't understand yet. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to organize a search of the immediate area. I'd like you to contact anyone else who might have spoken to your father recently. Neighbors, people in town, anyone who might have seen him in the past week." We spent the rest of the day conducting a systematic search of the area around Davidson's cabin. I called in additional deputies and volunteers from the local search and rescue team, and we worked in grid patterns through the forest, checking the creek banks, looking for signs of recent passage or anything that might indicate where Davidson had gone. Nothing. No footprints leading away from the cabin, no clothing caught on branches, no indication that anyone had passed through the dense forest around the clearing. It was as if Michael Davidson had simply vanished from his own property. That evening, I drove back to town with more questions than answers. I stopped by the grocery store, the hardware store, and the diner, asking if anyone had seen Davidson in the past week. The responses were consistent. Several people remembered seeing him the previous Tuesday, September 7th, when he'd come in for his usual weekly shopping trip. Friendly, but brief conversations. Nothing unusual about his behavior or demeanor. But no one had seen him since. I was reviewing my notes at home that night when my phone rang. It was Janet Morrison, who ran the register at Clearwater Market. "Sheriff Williams? I hope I'm not calling too late, but I just remembered something about Michael Davidson." "What's that, Janet?" "Well, you were asking if anyone had seen him lately, and I said last Tuesday. But now I'm thinking, I could swear I saw him in the store today, this afternoon, around 2 o'clock. I sat up straighter. "You saw Michael Davidson today?" "I think so. Same height, same gray beard, same green jacket he always wears. He was in the canned goods aisle, and I was going to say hello. But when I looked again, he was gone." "Are you certain it was him?" There was a pause. "Well, now that I think about it, maybe not. The person I saw seemed younger somehow, but he looked just like Michael." I thanked Janet and hung up, making a note to follow up the next morning. Eyewitness identification was notoriously unreliable, especially when someone was trying to remember a brief glimpse of a person in a crowded store. But it was worth checking out. The next morning, I drove back to Davidson's cabin to continue the search. Susan Martinez was still there, looking like she hadn't slept much. She'd been calling relatives and friends, but no one had heard from her father. "Any chance he might have gone to visit someone without telling you?" I asked. "Dad doesn't really have close friends. He's friendly with people in town, but he's not the type to just drop in on someone. And he would have called me if he was going anywhere." We expanded the search that day, bringing in dogs to help track any scent trails leading away from the cabin. The dogs showed some interest in the area around the front porch, but couldn't pick up a clear trail leading into the forest. It was as if Davidson's scent simply stopped at the edge of his property. That afternoon, I got another call. "Sheriff Williams? This is Tom Bradley at the hardware store. I heard you were asking about Michael Davidson." "That's right, Tom. Have you seen him recently?" "Well, that's the thing. I could swear he was just in here, maybe 20 minutes ago. Bought a bag of nails and some wood stain, paid cash, didn't say much, just like always. I was in my patrol car and driving toward town before Tom finished talking. When I got to the hardware store, Tom was behind the counter looking confused. Did he say anything to you, Tom? Anything about where he's been? That's the weird part, Sheriff. I was going to ask him about that because I heard he was missing. But when I looked up from the register to talk to him, he was already gone. And now, I'm starting to wonder if it was really him at all. What do you mean? Well, Michael's 67, right? This guy looked younger, maybe 50, 55. Same build, same beard, but younger. I checked with the other customers who'd been in the store, but no one else remembered seeing Davidson. Tom was starting to doubt himself, wondering if he'd imagined the whole encounter. Over the next 3 days, I received 6 more calls from people who thought they'd seen Michael Davidson around town. Each sighting was brief. Each witness became less certain when pressed for details, and each description was slightly different from the others. Same general appearance, but younger, or taller, or with different colored eyes. It was like someone who looked like Davidson was moving around Orofino, but never long enough for anyone to get a good look at him. On Friday afternoon, I was at my desk reviewing the case file when Miller knocked on my door. "Sheriff, we've got a situation. Michael Davidson is at his cabin." I looked up from the files. What do you mean? Susan Martinez just called, says her father's at the cabin acting like nothing happened. She's confused as hell. I grabbed my jacket and keys, calling for backup as I headed for the patrol car. 20 minutes later, I was pulling into the clearing in front of Davidson's cabin, where Susan Martinez was standing on the porch looking like she'd seen a ghost. "He's inside," she said as I approached, "making coffee like it's any other day." When I asked where he's been, he looked at me like I was crazy. Through the window, I could see a man moving around inside the cabin. Same build as the photos I'd seen of Davidson, same gray beard, wearing the green jacket that several witnesses had described. I knocked on the door. "Mr. Davidson, this is Sheriff Williams. I'd like to talk to you." The door opened, and I found myself face to face with Michael Davidson. Except it wasn't quite right. The man in front of me looked like Davidson, but younger, maybe 20 years younger. Same features but firmer, same gray beard but thicker. Same clothes, but they fit differently, like they belonged to someone else. "Sheriff Williams," he said with a smile. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Davidson, your daughter has been worried about you. She says you've been missing for over a week." The man, Davidson, or whoever he was, looked genuinely puzzled. "Missing?" "I've been right here, haven't gone anywhere." "Sir, we've searched this property extensively. The cabin was empty." "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I've been here all week, haven't left the property." I studied his face carefully. Either this man was lying with incredible conviction, or he genuinely believed what he was telling me. But something was wrong. The features were Davidson's, but the voice was slightly different. The mannerisms weren't quite right. It was like watching an actor playing a role based on photographs rather than personal observation. "Mr. Davidson, can you tell me what you did yesterday?" "Yesterday?" He thought about it. "Read for a while, worked in the garden, made dinner, same as always." "And the day before that?" "Same thing." "What about last Tuesday, September 7th? Do you remember going into town?" His expression became uncertain. "Last Tuesday, yes, I think I went to town, for supplies." "What did you buy?" The uncertainty increased. "The usual things. Groceries, I think." Susan Martinez stepped forward. "Dad, you've been missing for over a week. I drove up here on Monday and the cabin was empty. We've had search teams looking for you." Davidson looked at his daughter with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "Susan, sweetheart, I think you're mistaken. I've been here all along." I gestured toward Miller, who'd been standing quietly beside the patrol car. "Deputy Miller, would you check the cabin for any signs that someone's been living here recently?" Miller spent 10 minutes inside the cabin, then returned with a puzzled expression. "Everything looks like it's been lived in, Sheriff. Fresh food in the refrigerator, dishes that have been used recently, bed that's been slept in. That should have settled it, but something still felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what, but the man standing in front of me wasn't quite the Michael Davidson that Susan Martinez had described, or that the people in town remembered. "Mr. Davidson, would you mind if we took a photograph for our records, just to close out the missing person report?" "Of course." I took several photos with my camera, then thanked Davidson for his cooperation and told him we'd be in touch if we had any additional questions. As we were leaving, Susan pulled me aside. "Sheriff, that's my father, but something's not right. He looks younger, and he's acting strange. He didn't remember my phone number when I asked him to call me." "What do you mean?" "Dad's had the same phone routine for years. He calls me every Sunday at exactly 2 o'clock. When I asked him why he didn't call last Sunday, he said he'd forgotten. but Dad never forgets routine things. I promised Susan I'd look into it further, but privately I was starting to wonder if the stress of her father's disappearance had affected her perception. People often seemed different after traumatic events, and memory could be unreliable even under normal circumstances. That evening, I compared the photographs I'd taken that day with Davidson's driver's license photo from the DMV database. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same face, same features, same identifying marks, but there were subtle differences that were hard to quantify. The new photos showed a man who looked at least 10 years younger than he should have. I called the DMV and requested Davidson's complete file, including the date of his last license renewal. According to their records, Davidson had renewed his license just 3 months earlier, and the photo on file looked exactly like the man I'd met at the cabin. But the photo looked nothing like the person Susan Martinez had described as her father. Over the weekend, I made discreet inquiries around town about Davidson. The responses were consistent but puzzling. People remembered him as a quiet, older man who kept to himself. But when I showed them the photographs I'd taken on Friday, several people said the man in the photos looked younger than they remembered. On Monday morning, I got a call from Janet Morrison at the grocery store. "Sheriff Williams? Michael Davidson is here in the store right now. You said you wanted to know if anyone saw him." I was there in 5 minutes, but Davidson was already gone. Janet said he'd bought groceries and left without saying much, just like always. But when I asked her to describe him, her description matched the younger-looking man I'd met at the cabin. "Was this the same person you saw 2 weeks ago when Davidson came in for his regular shopping?" Janet frowned. "I thought so, but now I'm not sure. This guy seemed, I don't know, different somehow." I started keeping a log of Davidson sightings, and over the next month the pattern became clear. He was being seen regularly around town, but the descriptions were inconsistent. Sometimes he looked like the man I'd met at the cabin, younger, healthier, more vigorous. Sometimes witnesses described someone who matched Susan's description of her father. Older, more frail, moving carefully. It was as if there were 2 Michael Davidsons, and they were taking turns being seen in public. I decided to set up surveillance. On a Wednesday afternoon in early October, I parked my patrol car in a position where I could observe Davidson's cabin without being seen. I brought a thermos of coffee, a pair of binoculars, and a camera with a telephoto lens. If something strange was happening at the Davidson place, I was going to document it. At 2:47 p.m., a man who looked like Michael Davidson emerged from the cabin and walked toward the shed behind the house. Through my binoculars, I could see him clearly, definitely the younger version I'd met the previous month. He spent about 10 minutes doing something in the shed, then walked back to the cabin. At 3:15 p.m., the same man emerged from the cabin again. Except this time, he looked different. Older, moving more slowly, with the careful gait of someone dealing with age and possibly arthritis. It was unmistakably the same person, but 20 years older. I watched through the binoculars as this older version of Davidson walked to his mailbox at the end of the driveway, collected his mail, and walked back to the cabin. The entire trip took twice as long as it should have, with frequent pauses to rest. At 3:45 p.m., the younger version came out again. I photographed everything, switching between regular camera and binoculars, trying to document what I was seeing. But even as I watched it happen, I had trouble believing it was real. Over the next 2 hours, Michael Davidson, or whoever he was, emerged from the cabin 6 more times. Each time he appeared to be a different age. Sometimes he looked like a man in his 40s, moving with energy and purpose. Sometimes he looked like someone in his 70s, frail and uncertain. Most disturbing of all, Twice, I saw what appeared to be a version of Davidson who looked to be in his 20s. Tall, strong, with dark hair instead of gray. None of it made sense. I drove home that night with a collection of photographs that documented something impossible. The same man, aging and unaging over the course of an afternoon, cycling through decades of his own life like someone flipping through a photo album. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called Susan Martinez in Seattle. "Miss Martinez, this is Sheriff Williams. I have some questions about your father that might seem strange, but I need you to think carefully about the answers." "Of course, Sheriff. What is it?" "When you were growing up, did your father ever seem different from day to day? Like he was aging inconsistently, or looking younger or older than he should?" There was a long pause. "That's a very strange question, Sheriff." "I know it is, but please, think about it." Another pause. "Actually, yes. I remember thinking when I was a teenager that sometimes Dad looked much younger than other fathers, and sometimes he looked much older. I used to joke that he was aging in dog years instead of regular years. Did he ever explain this? I asked him about it once. He said some people aged differently than others, and that I shouldn't worry about it. But Sheriff, why are you asking about this?" I told her about my surveillance of the cabin, describing what I'd seen but leaving out the more incredible details. Even so, Susan was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Sheriff, my father has always been unusual. When I was growing up, people in our neighborhood used to comment about how he never seemed to age. Some people thought it was good genes. Others thought he dyed his hair and used makeup. But I lived with him, and I know it wasn't anything like that." "What do you think it was?" "I don't know. I've always just accepted that Dad was different from other people. He's been different my whole life." That afternoon, I drove back to Davidson's cabin, this time with Deputy Miller for backup. I wanted to confront Davidson directly about what I'd observed, even though I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd seen. We found him working in his garden, looking like a man in his early 50s. He greeted us pleasantly, as if it was perfectly normal for the sheriff to visit twice in 1 week. "Mr. Davidson, I need to ask you some questions that might seem unusual." "Of course, Sheriff." "Have you ever been told that you look different from day to day? That sometimes you appear younger or older than you should?" Davidson stopped what he was doing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "That's an interesting question. Is it true?" He was quiet for a long moment, then set down his gardening tools and walked over to the porch steps, gesturing for us to join him. "Sheriff, how much do you know about time?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean the nature of time, the way it moves, the way it affects people. Most folks assume time moves the same for everyone, that we all age at the same rate, experience days and years the same way." "Don't we?" Davidson smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "Some of us don't. Some of us exist differently. We move through time, but time doesn't move through us the same way." Miller was taking notes, but I could tell he was as confused as I was. "Mr. Davidson, I watched you yesterday afternoon. I saw you come out of this cabin looking like different ages, sometimes younger, sometimes older. How is that possible?" "Because I am different ages, Sheriff. I exist at multiple points in my own timeline simultaneously. Sometimes I'm the Michael Davidson who's 25. Sometimes I'm the one who's 40. Sometimes I'm the one who's 70. They're all me, just from different points in my life. That's not possible." Davidson stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. As I watched, his appearance began to shift. His hair darkened, his face became smoother, his posture straightened. Within seconds, he looked like a man 30 years younger. "Is this possible?" he asked in a voice that was unmistakably his, but higher, more energetic. Miller dropped his pen. Davidson shifted again, and suddenly he was older than I'd ever seen him. Bent, gray, moving with the careful steps of someone very near the end of life. "How about this?" he asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Then he was back to the middle-aged version we'd been talking to, as if nothing had happened. "I don't understand how this works," he said. "I've never understood it. But it's been happening my whole life. Sometimes I'm young, sometimes I'm old, sometimes I'm the age I'm supposed to be. I can't control it completely, but I can influence it sometimes." "When you went missing," I said, still trying to process what I'd just seen, "where did you go?" "I didn't go anywhere. But the version of me that you could see, that existed in this timeline at that moment, was elsewhere. Maybe in the past, maybe in the future. The cabin was empty because the Michael Davidson who lives here wasn't here. But you're here now. Some of me is here now. The parts of me that exist at this moment in this timeline." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. "Mr. Davidson, what you're describing is impossible." "Sheriff, impossible things happen every day. You're a law enforcement officer. You must have seen things that didn't make sense, things that couldn't be explained by normal logic." He was right, of course. In 9 years as sheriff, I'd encountered plenty of things that didn't fit into neat categories. But nothing like this. "Are there others like you?" "I don't know. I've never met anyone else who experiences time the way I do. Maybe I'm unique, or maybe there are others who hide it better than I do. Why are you telling me this?" Davidson, or whatever version of him I was talking to, looked tired suddenly. "Because I'm getting old, Sheriff. Not just this version of me, but all of me. The timeline is catching up with itself, and I think soon there won't be multiple versions anymore. Just one old man, aging normally until he dies. What does that mean for the people who've been seeing you around town?" "It means the sightings will become more consistent, less confusing. I'm becoming more singular." Over the following weeks, that's exactly what happened. The reports of Michael Davidson looking different ages stopped coming in. When people saw him in town, he consistently appeared to be a man in his late 60s, moving and behaving exactly as Susan had described her father. I continued to check on him periodically, partly out of professional duty and partly out of curiosity about his condition. Each time I visited, he looked a little older, a little more tired, but consistently the same age. 3 months later, Susan called to tell me her father had died peacefully in his sleep. She'd found him when she came up for her monthly visit, lying in his bed as if he'd simply chosen not to wake up. At the funeral, I met several people who'd known Davidson over the years. Their descriptions of him were wildly inconsistent. Some remembered him as a young, energetic man. Others recalled someone much older and more frail. But everyone agreed that he'd been kind, quiet, and somehow different from other people. Susan asked me to help clear out the cabin after the funeral. In his bedroom, I found a shoebox full of photographs that spanned what appeared to be decades of Davidson's life. But the photographs were dated, and the dates didn't make sense. There were pictures of Davidson as a young man dated from the 1990s, and pictures of him as an older man dated from the 1970s. Photos of him at different ages from the same year, sometimes the same month. It was like looking at a visual record of someone who'd lived his life out of sequence. At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to me. Sheriff Williams. If you're reading this, then I've died, and my timeline has finally become singular. Thank you for treating me with respect and dignity. when you could have easily dismissed me as crazy or dangerous. I never understood why I existed the way I did, only that I was different from other people. I spent most of my life hiding this difference, moving frequently, avoiding close relationships that might reveal my secret. Only my daughter knew, and only because it's hard to hide something like this from someone you're raising. I want you to know that I never used my condition to hurt anyone or gain unfair advantages. If anything, it made life more difficult and lonely than it should have been. I've left instructions with my lawyer that my property should be donated to the county for use as a park or nature preserve. I think the land deserves to outlast the strange man who lived on it. Thank you for being a good sheriff and for keeping my secret. Michael Davidson. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket, where it's remained ever since. I never told anyone else about Davidson's condition, not even Miller, who'd witnessed the transformation on the porch. Some secrets are too big and too strange to share. The Davidson property became a small county park, as he'd requested. There's a trail now that leads through the forest to his old cabin site, which we left as a small clearing with a picnic table and a plaque that reads, "In memory of Michael Davidson, who saw time differently than the rest of us." Sometimes I hike the trail and sit at that picnic table, thinking about time and aging and the assumptions we make about how life is supposed to work. I think about Davidson living his life out of sequence, aging and unaging, existing at multiple points in his own timeline simultaneously. And I wonder if he was really unique, or if there are others out there who experience time differently than the rest of us. People who age backward, or skip forward, or exist in multiple decades at once. In my line of work, you learn that the world is stranger and more complicated than most people want to believe. You learn that impossible things happen, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is accept them and move on. Michael Davidson taught me that time isn't as linear as we think it is, and that some people don't fit into the normal categories we use to understand human existence. He also taught me that being different doesn't make someone dangerous, and that sometimes the strangest people are also the kindest. I still get calls about unusual sightings sometimes. People who claim to see someone who looks like Davidson walking the trails around his old property. The descriptions vary widely, just like they used to. Sometimes he appears young, sometimes old, sometimes somewhere in between. I always investigate these calls, partly because it's my job and partly because I'm curious, but I never find anyone. Maybe it's just people's imaginations, triggered by the stories that have grown up around the Davidson place over the years. Or maybe some part of him is still out there, still aging and unaging, still existing at multiple points in his own timeline. I prefer to think it's the latter. After all, if time isn't as linear as we think it is, maybe death isn't as final as we assume either. Maybe Michael Davidson is still out there somewhere, sometime, living his life in whatever order makes sense to him. And maybe that's okay. The world is full of mysteries that don't need to be solved, and some questions are more important than their answers. Sometimes, the best thing a sheriff can do is acknowledge that there are forces in the world bigger than badges and reports, and the certainty that comes with thinking we understand how things work. Michael Davidson existed outside of time, and maybe some part of him still does. That's enough for me. My name is David Michael Thompson, and I've been sheriff of Millfield County, West Virginia for 14 years. Before that, I spent 7 years as a state trooper, working the mountain highways in small towns scattered throughout the Appalachian region where I grew up. Millfield County is coal country, or was until most of the mines shut down in the late 90s, leaving behind a population of about 4,200 people. spread across hollows and ridges that have been home to the same families for generations. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where secrets are hard to keep and grudges can last for decades. The county seat, Millfield, has maybe 800 people and sits in a valley between two mountains that block out the sun for most of the winter. People here tend to handle their own problems, partly out of tradition and partly out of necessity. The sheriff's department covers 420 square miles with just me and 3 deputies, so response times can be lengthy if you're calling from up in the mountains. Which is why the call I received on November 3rd, 2019 was unusual from the start. It came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night, when most of Millfield County was asleep and getting ready for another week of trying to make ends meet in an economy that had left them behind. Millfield County Sheriff's Office. This is Sheriff Thompson. The voice on the other end was elderly, female, and clearly agitated. Sheriff, this is Barbara Hensley up on Crow Mountain. I need someone to come up here about the noise. I knew Barbara Hensley by reputation. A widow in her 70s who lived alone in a house that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her nearest neighbors were at least half a mile away, which made a noise complaint from her location particularly unusual. What kind of noise are we talking about, Mrs. Hensley? It's coming from the old Pierce place next to mine. Sounds like a whole family over there, arguing, kids playing, doors slamming. Been going on for hours. The Pierce place. I knew that property too. It had been empty for almost 20 years, ever since the last of the Pierce family had moved away after old Walter Pierce died in 2001. The house had been sitting vacant all this time, slowly falling apart like so many abandoned properties throughout the county. Mrs. Hensley, are you sure the noise is coming from the Pierce house? That place has been empty for... I know how long it's been empty, Sheriff, she interrupted. I've been living next to it my whole life. I'm telling you, there's people in there making noise, and I want them gone. I grabbed my keys and jacket. I'll be up there in about 30 minutes, Mrs. Hensley. In the meantime, I want you to stay inside with your doors locked. The drive up Crow Mountain took me through some of the most isolated territory in Millfield County. The road was narrow, winding, and poorly maintained, climbing steadily through forest that pressed in close on both sides. There were no street lights, no houses visible from the road for long stretches, just the pale beam of my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Barbara Hensley's house sat in a small clearing about 8 miles up the mountain. A modest, 2-story structure that looked well-maintained despite its age. She met me at the front door before I could knock. A small, thin woman with white hair, and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she didn't miss much. Sheriff Thompson? Thank you for coming up. It's been quiet for the last few minutes, but earlier it was loud enough to wake the dead. I looked toward the Pierce property, which sat maybe 200 yards away through a stand of oak and maple trees. From where we stood, I could see the outline of a large, 2-story house with a sagging porch and broken windows. No lights, no signs of occupancy, no vehicles in the overgrown driveway. What kind of sounds were you hearing, Mrs. Hensley? Voices, mostly. Sounded like a man and woman arguing about something, and children running around upstairs. Doors slamming, footsteps on the porch. At one point, I could swear I heard a baby crying. I studied the Pierce house through the trees. If people were squatting there, they were doing it without electricity or visible light sources. Mrs. Hensley, I'm going to walk over there and check it out. I want you to stay here with your doors locked. The walk to the Pierce house took me through woods thick enough to block most of the moonlight. As I got closer, I could see it was in worse condition than I'd expected. The front porch was sagging badly, with several boards missing. Most of the windows were broken, and the front door was hanging open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I called out as I approached. "This is Sheriff Thompson. If anyone is in the house, I need you to come outside with your hands visible." No response. The smell hit me as soon as I reached the doorway. Not the musty smell of an abandoned house, but something else. Cooking food, cigarette smoke, and something that might have been baby powder. But when I shined my flashlight inside, the house was clearly empty. I systematically checked every room on both floors. Everything was the same, abandoned, dusty, clearly unoccupied for years. No sign that anyone had been in the house recently, but the smell persisted, stronger upstairs in what had probably been the master bedroom. I was about to head back downstairs when I heard it. Voices, quiet at first, then getting louder. A man and woman arguing about something, their words indistinct but their anger clear. It sounded like it was coming from the room I was standing in, but the room was empty. I drew my weapon and turned on the overhead light switch, but nothing happened. The electricity had been disconnected years ago. The voices continued, joined now by what sounded like children playing in another part of the house. Footsteps running up and down the hallway, doors opening and closing, the sound of laughter and crying mixing together. I moved carefully through the house, following the sounds, but I never found their source. Every room I entered was empty, but the sounds always seemed to be coming from somewhere else. The next room, the floor above, somewhere just out of sight. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. I stood in the middle of the empty house, listening to nothing but my own breathing. Whatever I'd been hearing was gone, leaving behind only the smell of cooking food and cigarette smoke in a house that had been abandoned for 20 years. Back at Barbara Hensley's house, she was waiting anxiously by her front window. "Did you find anyone, Sheriff?" "No, ma'am. The house is empty. But I did hear some sounds that were hard to explain." "You heard them too?" She looked relieved. I was starting to think I was going crazy. "What do you know about the Pierce family, Mrs. Hensley? Why did they leave?" Barbara invited me inside for coffee and told me the story of the Pierce family. Walter Pierce built that house in 1954, right after he came back from Korea, married Ruth Ann Mackenzie, and they started having children right away, had 5 kids altogether, 3 boys and 2 girls. They were good neighbors, Sheriff, normal family. She paused to pour coffee. Tragedy started in the winter of 1987. Their youngest boy, Tommy, he was just 4 years old, got sick. Some kind of fever that wouldn't break. Ruth Ann nursed him for weeks, but he just kept getting worse. Tommy died in February, right there in that house. Barbara's expression darkened. Ruth Ann never got over it. She started hearing things. Sounds of children playing, Tommy's voice calling for her. Walter thought she was having a breakdown, but she insisted the boy was still in the house somehow. "What kind of sounds?" "Same kinds of things you and I heard tonight." Footsteps upstairs, doors opening and closing, voices of children playing. Sometimes she'd set a place for Tommy at the dinner table, said he was still hungry. "How long did this go on?" "Years, Sheriff. Oh." Ruth Ann got worse and worse, spending all her time talking to empty rooms, cooking for family members who weren't there. The children left one by one as they got older. Couldn't stand living in that house anymore. By 1995, it was just Walter and Ruth Ann. What happened to them? Ruth Ann died in 1999. Cancer, though some people said it was really a broken heart. Walter tried to keep living there for a couple of more years, but he started hearing things too. Same sounds Ruth Ann had described. He died in 2001. Heart attack, right there in the kitchen. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 4 more calls about noise from the Pierce house. Each time, it was the same story. Sounds of family life coming from an empty house, lasting for hours and then stopping abruptly when I arrived to investigate. On my third visit, I brought Deputy Martinez. She heard the same things I did: voices, footsteps, doors closing, but we never found any explanation. I started researching, looking for logical explanations, but none of the usual causes: settling timbers, wind patterns, acoustic properties, explained what we were hearing. The sounds were too specific, too much like actual human activity. On November 27th, Barbara Hensley called again. "Sheriff, it's happening again. But this time it's different, there's more of them. Sounds like a crowd of people over there. And Sheriff, I can hear singing." I arrived just as the sound stopped. This time, the silence felt different. Heavier, more final. The front door, which had been hanging open on all my previous visits, was now firmly shut. When I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge, not locked, just stuck, as if something was holding it closed from the inside. I went around back and climbed through a window. Inside, the house felt different. The air was warmer, and there was something else. The lingering sound of voices, not quite audible, but definitely present. In the kitchen, I found something that made my blood run cold. The old wooden dining table, which had been covered with dust and debris on my previous visits, was now clean. 6 place settings had been arranged on its surface: plates, glasses, silverware, even cloth napkins. A 7th setting, smaller than the others, sat at the end of the table, a child's setting. I photographed everything, then left, and spent the rest of the night trying to make sense of what was happening. The next morning, I called Sarah Pierce Morrison, Walter's eldest daughter, who now lived in Ohio. "Sheriff Thompson, I appreciate you calling. Has someone finally expressed interest in buying the property?" I described the unusual incidents. Sarah was quiet for several minutes. "Sheriff, what you're describing sounds exactly like what we used to hear when I was growing up. We all heard them. Sounds of children playing, adults talking, doors opening and closing. Mom insisted it was Tommy, that he was still in the house somehow. Did it ever stop? Not while we lived there. Even after Tommy died, even after Mom died, even after Dad died, the sounds continued. It's part of why no one wants to buy the property. Do you have any explanation? Sheriff, I believe some places hold on to the people who lived there. Good memories, bad memories, strong emotions. They soak into the walls and they don't let go. That house contains the entire history of my family, and sometimes that history makes itself known." After that conversation, I decided to spend a night in the Pierce house myself. On December 10th, I sat up in the front room with a sleeping bag and coffee. Around midnight, I started to hear something else. It began as conversations in another room, gradually becoming clearer. A man and woman discussing the day's events, children playing upstairs, the sounds of dishes being cleared from dinner. Normal, domestic sounds that would have been unremarkable in any other context. But this house had been empty for 20 years. I followed the sounds through the house. In the kitchen, I found the dining table set for 7 again, but this time there was food on the plates. Or the appearance of food. I could see outlines of what looked like a roast, mashed potatoes, green beans. But when I reached out to touch them, my hand passed through empty air. Upstairs, I heard children's voices more clearly. 2 boys arguing about toys. A girl singing. Small feet running in the hallway. In the master bedroom, I could hear a woman humming a lullaby. I stood in the doorway and listened to Ruth Ann Pierce singing to her dead son, just as she had done for years after Tommy died. At 3:17 a.m., everything went silent at once, as if someone had turned off a radio. When I tried to record these sounds on subsequent visits, there was nothing on the tape. Whatever was in that house didn't want to be documented. I called Sarah Pierce Morrison again. That doesn't surprise me, Sheriff. Whatever is in that house doesn't want to be documented. It just wants to exist. Is there anything that can be done about it? Sheriff, what you heard was my family. All of us together the way we used to be before tragedy scattered us. The sounds don't hurt anyone. They're just memories made audible. Maybe Mrs. Hensley needs to understand that she's not hearing strangers. She's hearing neighbors she knew for 40 years. I drove back to talk with Barbara Hensley and explained what I thought was happening. You think I've been hearing Walter and Ruth Ann and their children? I think it's possible. Barbara walked to her porch, looking toward the Pierce house. You know, Sheriff, I was so focused on the noise that I never really listened to what it sounded like. But now that you mention it, I can almost hear Ruth Ann's voice when the woman speaks. She was quiet for several minutes. I miss them. I lived next to that family for almost 4 decades. When they all moved away or died, this mountain got very lonely. So, hearing them again. If that's really what it is, then maybe it's not a disturbance. Maybe it's a gift. Over the following weeks, Barbara stopped calling to complain. When I checked on her, she said she'd started thinking of the sounds as a company rather than disturbance. Last night, I heard Ruth Ann humming while she did dishes. Same song she used to hum when we'd visit. It was comforting. But then, other people started hearing the sounds. Word spread, and soon people were driving up Crow Mountain specifically to listen for the Pierce family voices. The increased traffic created problems. People parking on the narrow road, trying to break into the house, leaving trash. On February 14th, 2020, things escalated when college students came with recording equipment. At 11:30 p.m., I received a panicked call. Sheriff, you need to get up here. Something's happening at this house and we're scared. I found 4 college kids huddled in their car, equipment scattered around the yard. According to their account, the normal family sounds had begun, but then the voices got angry. The man was yelling about strangers in his house, people who didn't belong there. The woman was crying, and the children sounded scared. Then we heard footsteps on the porch, like someone was coming outside. Did you see anyone? No, but the front door slammed open, and we heard a man's voice shouting at us to get off his property. Inside the house, I could sense a different atmosphere, angry energy that made my hair stand up. I called out to the empty house. Walter, Ruth Ann, this is Sheriff Thompson. These kids didn't mean any harm. The response was immediate. A man's voice, clear and angry, from upstairs. Get them off my property. This is my home. I understand, Walter, but the house has been empty for 20 years. It's not empty. My family lives here. We've always lived here. I realize that, from Walter Pierce's perspective, time might not work the same way. If the house contained memories of the family's life there, those memories might exist outside normal time. Walter, I'm going to make sure people stop bothering your family. The angry energy in the house seemed to diminish. Tell them to stay away. This is our home. We just want to be left alone. After the students left, I made a decision. I posted no trespassing signs around the Pierce property and asked Barbara Hensley to help me keep curiosity seekers away. Those people have been my neighbors for 40 years, Sheriff. If they need protecting, I'm willing to help. The arrangement worked well for several months, but in late spring 2020, something changed. Barbara called on May 15th, her voice different. Not scared, but sad. Sheriff, I think something's wrong at the Pierce house. The sounds are different, quieter and sadder. Instead of children playing and family dinners, I'm hearing crying. A woman crying, like her heart is broken. What I heard that night broke my heart. Instead of vibrant family life, the sounds were those of a family in decline. Ruth Ann's voice crying softly in the kitchen. Walter's heavy footsteps, pacing like a man carrying unbearable weight. And underlying it all, the absence of children's voices, as if the family was reliving the years after their children had grown up and moved away. Over the following weeks, the sounds became increasingly melancholy. Then, on June 3rd, they stopped completely. A week later, Barbara Hensley had a heart attack while working in her garden and died on the way to the hospital. I drove up Crow Mountain one last time after her funeral. The house stood empty and silent. But as I was walking back to my patrol car, I heard something that made me stop. Voices. Quiet, but unmistakably present. A man and woman talking softly, and with them, an older woman's voice that sounded remarkably like Barbara Hensley. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was warm, welcoming, like neighbors greeting each other after a long separation. For just a moment, I'd heard what sounded like a reunion. The Pierce family welcoming their longtime neighbor to whatever existence they shared in that old house. I never heard the sounds again. 6 months later, a windstorm brought down a tree that fell across the house and damaged it beyond repair. The county had it demolished, returning the site to forest. Today, there's nothing left except a small clearing and a few foundation stones. But sometimes people driving past report hearing voices drifting down from the hillside. Family voices, talking and laughing together, accompanied by the sound of an older woman telling stories on a porch that no longer exists. I retired 2 years ago, but I still drive up Crow Mountain occasionally. I've never heard the voices myself during these visits, but I like to think they're still there. The Pierce family and Barbara Hensley, existing together in whatever dimension memories create when they're strong enough to transcend time. In my 14 years as sheriff, I learned that some mysteries don't need to be solved, and some disturbances don't need to be stopped. Sometimes the best thing law enforcement can do is provide protection for things that exist outside our normal understanding. The Pierce family taught me that home is more than just a building, and that love leaves echoes that can persist long after the voices that created them have fallen silent. They also taught me that being a good neighbor doesn't end with death, and that sometimes what sounds like disturbance is really just the sound of people living their lives, even when those lives exist in dimensions we don't fully understand. Crow Mountain is quiet now, but it's not empty. Some sounds are too meaningful to fade completely, and some families are too close to be separated by something as simple as death. My name is Michael Robert Davis, and I've been sheriff of Crawford County, Kansas for 11 years. Before that, I spent 6 years as a deputy here and 4 years with the Kansas Highway Patrol, working mostly the rural areas where the job involves everything from traffic accidents to domestic disputes to searching for lost hunters in the vast wheat fields that stretch from horizon to horizon. Crawford County sits in the southeastern corner of Kansas, where the land starts to roll, and the farms get smaller as you approach the Missouri border. We cover about 595 square miles with a population of just over 39,000 people, most of them concentrated in the county seat of Pittsburgh, with the rest scattered across small farming communities and isolated properties where neighbors might be miles apart. It's the kind of place where people come when they want to disappear from whatever life they left behind. The combination of cheap land, low population density, and a tradition of minding your own business makes Crawford County attractive to folks who value privacy above convenience. We get our share of retirees looking for a quiet place to spend their golden years, young families seeking affordable land to raise their children, and the occasional person running from something they'd rather not discuss. The call came in on January 8, 2020, at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. It was one of those gray January days when the sky looks like dirty snow, and the wind cuts through your jacket like it's looking for something to freeze. I was in my office reviewing budget requests, trying to figure out how to justify new equipment purchases to a county commission that considered law enforcement an unnecessary expense. Crawford, County Sheriff's Office. This is Sheriff Davis. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, with the kind of careful pronunciation that suggested medical training. Sheriff Davis, this is Dr. Margaret Sullivan at Pittsburgh Community Hospital. I'm calling about one of my patients, Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman. I believe she lives out in your county, and I'm concerned about her welfare. I knew the name Dorothy Kellerman, though I'd never met her personally. She lived alone on a small farm about 15 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, one of those elderly residents who kept to themselves and handled their own problems without bothering law enforcement. From what I recalled, she was in her late 70s, widowed, and had been living on the same property for decades. What kind of concern are we talking about, Doctor? Sullivan? Mrs. Kellerman was scheduled for a follow-up appointment this morning after some tests we ran last week. When she didn't show up, my office called her home number, but there was no answer. Given her age and some recent health issues, I'm worried something might have happened to her. What kind of health issues? I can't go into specifics due to patient confidentiality, but she's been dealing with some serious conditions that require regular monitoring. It's very unlike her to miss an appointment without calling. She's always been very punctual and responsible about her medical care. I grabbed a pen and pulled out an incident log. Welfare checks on elderly residents were a regular part of rural law enforcement, and they usually turned out to be nothing more than miscommunication or transportation problems. But they were also how we occasionally found people who'd fallen, had heart attacks, or otherwise needed help that wouldn't come if we didn't check. Dr. Sullivan, do you have contact information for any of Mrs. Kellerman's relatives? Anyone we should notify if there's a problem? That's part of my concern, Sheriff. According to her records, she listed no emergency contacts. No children, no siblings, no close friends. As far as I know, she lives completely alone out there. That wasn't unusual in rural Kansas. A lot of elderly people outlived their families and support networks, ending up isolated on properties that were too much for them to maintain but too sentimental to leave. I'll drive out there this afternoon, Dr. Sullivan. If she's okay, I'll have her call your office. If there's a problem, I'll contact you immediately. Thank you, Sheriff. I really appreciate it. I've been treating Mrs. Kellerman for about 3 years now, and she's never missed an appointment without calling ahead. The drive to Dorothy Kellerman's place took me through the kind of countryside that made Kansas famous. Vast fields of winter wheat stubble, farmhouses sitting like islands in oceans of cultivated land, grain elevators rising like church spires against the flat horizon. It was beautiful in its own way, if you appreciated the subtle aesthetics of agricultural geometry and big sky country. The Kellerman farm sat at the end of a gravel road that wandered through sections of cropland before ending at a cluster of buildings that looked like they'd been there since the 1940s. A modest white farmhouse with green shutters, a red barn that had seen better decades, a few outbuildings and maybe 40 acres of farmland that looked like it hadn't been actively worked in recent years. As I pulled into the driveway, I could see that the property was well maintained despite its age. The house paint was relatively fresh, the yard was neat and tidy, and there was nothing about the place that suggested neglect or abandonment. A late model Honda Civic sat in the driveway, which meant Mrs. Kellerman was probably home and simply hadn't heard the phone or chosen not to answer it. I parked next to the Honda and walked up to the front porch, noting that the sidewalk had been recently shoveled and that snow had been cleared from the steps. Someone was definitely taking care of the property, which was a good sign. I knocked on the front door and waited. When there was no immediate response, I knocked again, louder this time. Mrs. Kellerman, this is Sheriff Davis. Dr. Sullivan asked me to check on you. I heard footsteps inside the house, and a moment later the door opened to reveal a woman who looked to be in her mid-60s. She was petite, well-dressed in a sweater and slacks, with graying hair that had been recently styled, and the kind of alert expression that suggested good health and mental acuity. Sheriff Davis, what can I do for you? Mrs. Kellerman, I'm here because Dr. Sullivan was concerned when you missed your appointment this morning. She wanted to make sure you were all right. The woman looked puzzled, her eyebrows drawing together in confusion. I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I think there's been some mistake. I don't have a doctor named Sullivan, and I didn't have any appointment today. I checked my notes, making sure I had the right information. Ma'am, you are Dorothy Kellerman, correct? Yes, I'm Dorothy Kellerman. And you live at 1247 County Road 225? That's right. Dr. Sullivan at Pittsburgh Community Hospital said you were scheduled for a follow-up appointment this morning after some tests last week. Dorothy Kellerman's expression became even more puzzled. Sheriff, I haven't been to any hospital recently, and I certainly haven't had any tests done. I think someone has made an error. I studied her carefully. She looked healthy, alert, and completely genuine in her confusion. But medical records didn't usually get confused about things like missed appointments and patient information. Mrs. Kellerman, when was the last time you saw a doctor? Oh, it's been months. I had my annual physical back in September with Dr. Patterson in Pittsburgh, but that's the only medical care I've needed recently. You haven't been having any health problems? Nothing serious. The usual aches and pains that come with getting older, but nothing that requires constant medical attention. Something nagged at me as I walked back to my patrol car. Dorothy Kellerman looked significantly younger than the 70-something woman doctor Sullivan had described. Her movements were sprightly, her voice was strong, and she had the general appearance of someone in her early 60s rather than late 70s. People age differently, and medical records could be wrong about ages, but the discrepancy seemed significant. I drove back to town and called Dr. Sullivan from my office. Dr. Sullivan, this is Sheriff Davis. I checked on Mrs. Kellerman and she's fine, but there seems to be some confusion about her medical care. She says she hasn't been to your hospital recently and doesn't have any current health problems. There was a pause. That's unusual. Let me check her file. I could hear papers rustling in the background. Sheriff, I'm looking at Dorothy Kellerman's chart right now. Date of birth, March 15th, 1943, which makes her 76 years old. Address, 1247 County Road 225. She was here last Tuesday for blood work related to her heart condition and diabetes management. Dr. Sullivan, the woman I just spoke with looks like she's in her early 60s, and she seems to be in excellent health. Are you sure we're talking about the same person? Sheriff, I've been treating Mrs. Kellerman for 3 years. I know what she looks like. She's a small woman, maybe 5 feet 2 inches, probably weighs about 120 pounds. Gray hair, usually worn short. She moves carefully due to arthritis, and she's been having some memory issues that we've been monitoring. That wasn't the woman I'd just met. The Dorothy Kellerman I'd spoken with was closer to 5 feet 6 inches, moved with easy confidence, and showed no signs of memory problems or physical limitations. Dr. Sullivan, I think we need to figure out what's going on here. Is it possible there are 2 Dorothy Kellermans in your system? Let me check our database more thoroughly. I waited while Dr. Sullivan searched her computer system. Sheriff, we only have 1 Dorothy Kellerman in our system, and she lives at the address you visited, but now I'm concerned that something isn't right. What do you mean? According to our records, Mrs. Kellerman died 3 months ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What did you say?" "Sheriff, I'm looking at her file, and there's a death certificate dated October 12th, 2019. Cause of death was complications from diabetes and heart failure." I sat in my patrol car outside Dorothy Kellerman's house for the second time that day, staring at the well-maintained property and trying to make sense of what Dr. Sullivan had told me. According to medical records, the woman who'd answered the door and spoken with me for 5 minutes had been dead for 3 months. But she'd been very much alive, very much coherent, and very much present in a house that showed clear signs of ongoing habitation. I decided to knock on the door again. This time, Dorothy Kellerman answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside. "Sheriff Davis? Did you forget something?" "Mrs. Kellerman, I need to ask you a few more questions. Can I come inside?" "Of course." She led me into a living room that was impeccably maintained and clearly lived in. Recent newspapers were folded on the coffee table. A cup of tea was cooling on a side table, and everything suggested the normal daily routine of someone going about their business. "Mrs. Kellerman, I need you to think carefully about this. Have you been to Pittsburgh Community Hospital at any time in the past few months?" She thought about it seriously. "No, Sheriff, I told you. I haven't needed medical care recently." "What about last October?" "Around the 12th. Her expression became uncertain. "October? I'm having trouble remembering October clearly. Why do you ask?" "Mrs. Kellerman, what's today's date?" "It's January 8th. "What year?" She paused, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked confused. "It's 2020, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Kellerman, do you remember being sick? Do you remember any time when you had to go to the hospital?" The confusion on her face deepened. There was something. In the fall. I felt very tired, and I was having trouble. Trouble with something, but I can't remember what it was. "Mrs. Kellerman, when you look in the mirror, how do you look to yourself?" "I'm sorry?" "Do you look the way you expect to look? The age you expect to be?" She stared at me for a long moment, then walked over to a mirror hanging on the living room wall. She stood in front of it for almost a minute, studying her reflection with growing bewilderment. "This isn't right," she said quietly. "What isn't right? I look younger. I should look older than this." She turned back to me with fear in her eyes. "Sheriff, what's happening to me?" I called the county coroner's office from Mrs. Kellerman's kitchen phone while she sat in her living room, still staring at the mirror with confusion and growing fear. "County coroner's office, this is Janet." "Janet, this is Sheriff Davis. I need you to look up a death certificate for Dorothy Kellerman. Should be dated October 12th, 2019. "Hold on, Sheriff." I waited, listening to the sound of filing cabinets opening and papers rustling. "Sheriff, I've got the certificate right here. Dorothy Kellerman, age 76, died at Pittsburgh Community Hospital on October 12th, 2019. Cause of death was complications from diabetes and congestive heart failure." "Janet, where was she buried?" "Let me check. Elmwood Cemetery in Pittsburgh. Plot 247 in Section C." "Was there a funeral? Any family involved?" According to the notes, it was a county burial. No known relatives, no funeral service, just a basic burial arrangement paid for by the county. I thanked Janet and hung up, then called Dr. Sullivan back and asked her to walk me through Dorothy's final hospital stay. Mrs. Kellerman was admitted on October 8th with complications from her diabetes. Her blood sugar levels were dangerously high, and she was showing signs of diabetic ketoacidosis. We managed to stabilize her initially, but she developed heart problems and went into congestive heart failure. She became confused, then unconscious. She died on the morning of October 12th without regaining consciousness. Who identified the body? The body was identified by hospital staff based on personal effects and the patient identification bracelet. She had no known family, so the county handled the burial arrangements. After I hung up, I verified that Dorothy's utilities were current, her bills had been paid, and her mail was still being delivered. According to all evidence, Dorothy Kellerman was alive and maintaining her household. But according to official records, she had died 3 months ago. I spent the next hour asking Dorothy personal questions to verify her identity. Everything checked out. Full name, birth date, social security number. Details about her life and deceased husband Walter, who had died in 1997. Mrs. Kellerman, I need to ask you something that might sound strange. Do you remember dying? She stared at me for a long moment. Do I remember what? Dying, being in the hospital in October, being very sick, possibly losing consciousness. Her expression became distant, as if she was trying to access memories that were difficult to reach. There was darkness. I remember feeling very tired, and then everything went dark, but then I was back here in my house and everything was normal again. When do you remember being back in your house? I'm not sure. Time has been strange lately. Sometimes I think it's October, sometimes I think it's January. Sometimes I feel like no time has passed at all since Walter died. Over the following weeks, I checked on Dorothy regularly. Sometimes I found the younger, healthier version of Dorothy, who seemed to have no memory of being sick or dying. Sometimes I found an older, frail version who was clearly dying, but somehow persisting in her own home, rather than a hospital bed. Occasionally, I found versions of Dorothy that seemed to be from different decades altogether. A middle-aged woman mourning her husband's recent death. A young woman excited about fixing up the farmhouse. Even once an elderly woman who seemed confused about what decade it was. Dr. Sullivan continued to call periodically, expressing confusion about Dorothy's medical records. According to the hospital system, Dorothy Kellerman was deceased, but her file continued to show activity. Insurance claims, prescription refills, appointment schedules that appeared automatically without anyone making them. It's like the computer system thinks she's still alive, Dr. Sullivan told me during one of our conversations. Her chart keeps updating itself with normal vital signs, regular medication schedules, even appointment reminders. But she's been dead for months. The situation continued for several months, with Dorothy existing in her strange state between life and death, cycling through different versions of herself from different periods of her life. I became the only person who knew about her condition, the only witness to her impossible existence. Then, in early June 2020, I received a call from the cemetery office. Sheriff Davis? This is Rick at Elmwood Cemetery. We've got a situation with that grave in Section C, Plot 247, the Kellerman grave. What kind of situation? The grave is empty, Sheriff. We were doing some maintenance work in that section, and we noticed that the soil had settled more than it should have. When we investigated, we found that the casket is gone. Gone? The grave has been dug up from the inside, Sheriff. Like someone clawed their way out. I drove to the cemetery immediately and found Rick standing beside the empty grave, looking confused and disturbed. The grave had indeed been excavated from within. The soil was pushed outward from the center, and scratch marks on the sides of the grave suggested something had clawed its way to the surface. I drove to Dorothy Kellerman's house one last time, not sure what I would find. The house was dark, and when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I used the key Dorothy had given me during one of our conversations when she was the younger version of herself who trusted neighbors and didn't worry about security. Inside, the house felt different. not empty exactly, but final. Like a story that had reached its conclusion. In the living room, I found a note written in Dorothy's handwriting. Sheriff Davis, thank you for checking on me all these months. I know my situation has been confusing, but I think I finally understand what happened to me. I died in the hospital on October 12th, just like the records say. But somehow, part of me couldn't let go of this house, of the life Walter and I built here. So I stayed, existing in the memories of all the years we spent together. I've been living through our entire life together, over and over, the good years and the difficult ones, the times when we were young and full of hope, and the lonely years after Walter died. It's been a gift, in a way, to experience all of it again. But I can't stay anymore. It's time for me to join Walter, wherever he is. The house needs to belong to the living now, not to memories of what used to be. I've left instructions with my lawyer to donate the property to the county for use as a park or nature preserve. I think this land deserves to outlast the people who loved it. Thank you for treating me with kindness and respect when you could have easily dismissed me as crazy or impossible. You're a good sheriff and a good man. Dorothy Kellerman. I never saw Dorothy Kellerman again. The house sat empty for several months while the county worked out the legal details of accepting the donated property. Eventually, it became a small nature preserve, with the farmhouse restored as a visitor center and the surrounding land maintained as a wildlife habitat. There's a plaque by the front door that reads, "In memory of Dorothy and Walter Kellerman, who loved this land and shared it with all who needed a home." Sometimes, people visiting the preserve report seeing an elderly woman in the farmhouse, usually in the kitchen or sitting on the front porch. The descriptions vary. Sometimes she appears to be in her 20s, sometimes in her 70s, sometimes somewhere in between. But the sightings are always peaceful. People say she seems content, like someone who's found her way home after a long journey. I retired from the sheriff's department last year, but I still visit the Kellerman Preserve occasionally. I've never seen Dorothy myself during these visits, but sometimes I catch a glimpse of movement in the farmhouse windows, or I smell coffee brewing when the building is supposed to be empty. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the afternoon light is filtering through the trees, I hear voices from the front porch. A man and woman talking quietly, the way couples do when they've been together for decades and don't need many words to communicate. Dorothy Kellerman taught me that dying doesn't always mean leaving, and that sometimes the most important part of a person's existence is the love they shared and the places they called home. She also taught me that time isn't as linear as we think it is, and that some people don't let go of life easily, especially when that life was shared with someone they can't bear to leave behind. The Kellerman Preserve is open to the public now, and people come from all over Kansas to walk the trails and visit the farmhouse. Most of them are drawn by the natural beauty of the place, but some come because they've heard stories about the woman who loved her home so much that death couldn't make her leave it. In my 11 years as sheriff, I learned that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. I learned that some mysteries don't need to be solved, and that sometimes the most important part of keeping the peace is recognizing when something beautiful is happening, even if it doesn't fit into normal categories of understanding. Dorothy Kellerman taught me that some wellness checks reveal more about the nature of life and death than they do about whether someone needs medical attention. And she taught me that caring for people doesn't end when they die. Sometimes it just takes different forms. The last entry in Dorothy Kellerman's case file reads, "Subject relocated. No further welfare checks required." But that's not really true. I'll be checking on Dorothy Kellerman for the rest of my life. Every time I drive past the preserve and see lights in the farmhouse windows, every time I hear stories about the woman who loved her home too much to leave it. Some wellness checks never really end. They just become part of the ongoing work of caring for the people and places that make our communities whole.